thank you very much for being here this afternoon. And um, I do realize that having been in Iraq in the last few months, and also in constant touch with the people who are working for what we would call conflict resolution, and improving of what we the intrafaith more than interfaith relations. When I talk about interfaith, we are talking about the Shia-Sunni relationship in Iraq. And in the last, I think, few years since the American invasion, we have seen a different kind of configuration of sectarian relationship in Iraq, which somehow has an impact on the surrounding areas. We cannot say that that which happens in Iraq happens only in Iraq. It has implications around in the other countries also, because it's an important issue. Since, I would say, since 1978-79, when Iranian Revolution occurred, I think there was already a question about the legitimacy of that claim that Iran made as an Islamic revolution, because it was a Shi'i revolution. And if I remember being in the 1990s in Jordan, teaching a course in the Kulliyat Sharia there, and there was always this question there whether Iran is representing all the Muslims or specifically a particular sect. Now, I must be very clear here that one of the reasons why I was invited to go to Kufa was some of my work in Jerusalem in conflict resolution. We have been sent, there was a team of us who went on behalf of the United Nations to build bridges of understanding between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim community in Jerusalem and other places, occupied territories. So we had, I would say that our experiment in Jerusalem was held as partly successful, because what we were able to do was increase awareness in the textbooks in Israel, especially to be more inclusive in teaching children of the relationship between Jewish and Arab children. And I think we were successful to some extent to make the educators aware that the problems had to start much earlier in the education of the children. But in Iraq, the situation was different, because there were different groups of the people who were represented in Kufa University at that time, including Christians, Turkmen Sunnis who were not Arab Sunnis. So you have also the ethnic diversity, which impinges upon what the citizenship that it should be recognized of all Iraqis. What I found to be the fundamental problem that I was asked to address was the sources of conflict in Iraq. And that's not easy to do when you are an outsider coming from America and talking to the people in the region. But I think partly because of the experience that I had, and I studied in Najaf myself for several years. I was there, so I knew the situation. To some extent, I was an insider to the problem itself. What I found to be the major source of conflict in Iraq, interfaith conflict, I'm more dealing with interfaith at the moment, then I'll come to interfaith, was the exclusivity that was being pushed forward by the religious leaders. In many cases, I found that it was the religious leaders who were involved in promoting sectarianism in a very subtle way, through the preachings, through the teachings, through the textbooks that were being written there were new textbooks being written, and are still being written, because the textbooks that were written during Saddam's time have become all of a sudden illegitimate textbooks, especially those that deal with the Islamic situation with the different Sunni and Shia perspectives on it. So what I found was that the textbook, and I firmly believe that the textbooks have a role to play in the religious teachings, because these textbooks are progressively graded from the lower grades to the high school, and they continue to somehow negotiate the intrafaith culture that is predominant in Iraq. And during Saddam's time, I have visited Iraq even during those days when Saddam was in power. There was no open discussion about it. But now there was open discussion about it because the new government, that is the Shi'i dominant government, wanted to see that there was enough revision taking place in the textbooks that were being used in the schools. And what I found to be very true in these textbooks was the exclusive beliefs founded upon a claim of truth either by the Shia now and at that time by the Sunni. So you have both sects claiming some kind of exclusive truth, and that was what being transmitted to the students. The second notion that I found to be prevalent in the textbook was the sense of superiority of one school over the other. So you will hear, for example, among the religious leaders, almost a language of chosen people, almost a language of chosen people, as if not only the truth was not sufficient, but it was also the superiority of the claim of the truth. So if there were textbooks in those days of Saddam that I have not examined those textbooks, but I'm speculating that there must have been textbook at that time talking about the superiority of the Sunni school and trying to somehow accommodate the majority, but a school that was predominantly controlled by the Sunni establishment. And what I found to be true was that this was translated in sociological terms in the area of economy, in the area of social interaction, including the bazaars and the areas where people were generating wealth, and also in the political culture. There was this kind of ideas being spread, and sectarianism was becoming an issue even in the political realm, where it is true that Maliki was not a very fair-minded leader, but there were already religious leaders who were pushing for one or the other kind of superiority claim, and its direct translation into economic privileges, in getting the funding for something. All these things were connected at that time. And what I found to be very disturbing was that the religious leaders were not talking to one another. They were not speaking to one another about the issues that were confronting the communities. So my first reaction was that there is a politics of dominance prevailing in Iraq in such a way that it would not allow for the dialogue to come about. Because what dialogue did presuppose was somehow equality of the parties connected in the dialogue, coming together for a dialogue, and that I did not see. Now it was a Shi'i dominance. So in Kufa University, for example, it was quite revealing to see that there was Sunni token presence in every aspect of administration. So there were Sunnis participating in administration, there were Sunni faculty members. Even in the Kulliyat Sharia, there was some room for the Sunni schools to teach and to produce their own graduate students. But overall, it was a Shia-dominated university. Kufa University is in Najaf, in the heart of Shi'i, city, and therefore it had a very clear goal of even in the rational sciences, they would make a very general comment that the Sunnis do not have ijtihad, or they do not have independent reasoning, and they should learn from the Shia about this. And that kind of approach, I think, I found to be quite unpalatable to the Sunni leaders. Not only the Sunni leaders, but the Shia, although also the Christian leaders were disturbed of the claims that were being put forward by this superiority, this politics of dominance. And I found that the perpetuation of economic gaps in the population, I think we are going to hear Professor Joan Cole coming here, and he will be speaking about the class struggle. But I think I could sense it, that the underdogs under Saddam had now achieved powerful positions. So they were taking revenge in some ways by claiming more than they would deliver. And I think those promises were there in the air. And I found that fundamental human rights could be violated very easily now in reverse. If there was something that was happening under Saddam, and I could see, we could feel that, and we were never left alone, when during Saddam's visit. Now there was in the opposite direction, there was this culture of domination by the Shia majority, but in a different way. In other words, there was very little dialogue taking place on how exactly should the power distribution be worked out in the new administration. How exactly should one do that? And I think there was a source of a lot of fear in the country. Mosul, for example, if we're talking about this ISIS now, Mosul, the population of Mosul did not like the harassment by the Shia soldiers. The Shia soldiers were actually harassing and were humiliating the Sunni population by their strictness. And so there was a reverse kind of what I saw, for example, in Israel. The complaint of the Palestinian was a very similar complaint that we are being humiliated by the dominant power. And here also we had a very similar situation, that the dominant power was the Shia power that was humiliating, and therefore ISIS could succeed by actually local support. The local people were supporting ISIS in the beginning. So we heard that a few months ago that Mosul would not have been controlled, would not have come under the ISIS control if there was no support from the population itself. And the population was actually very much disturbed by the ways in which Shia favorism was working in the society as a whole. And so you have clearly within Iraq itself, the dialogue has not begun. This is my own observation. The dialogue has not begun. Now, what my work and the work of my colleagues, including Roy Muttahede from Harvard University, and there were some colleagues from Rutgers University, we were all there trying to help Iraqi leaders. And these were policymakers, religious leaders, trying to tell them that one of the ways of handling this situation would be a new kind of general education that is necessary to be implemented in the society as a whole. And it's not only the security of Najaf that matters. It's not only the security of Karbala that matters. It is the security of Iraq that matters. And in that, I think there has to be more participation by the population that has been at the moment being left aloof, and they have been isolated somehow. The Sunnis were not given very important positions in the society, and therefore there was grievance that we are being systematically discriminated by the government, and the institutions are not helping us. Now, I constantly heard the history of this discrimination under Saddam and the reverse things that were done under Saddam for 50 years, whatever it is. But the handling of that by the Iraqi government that is in power, by the Shia government, was not correct at all. In my opinion, they were seeking more problems rather than solving them. The other thing that was quite disturbing was the ethnic nature of political process. There was this Arabism, because after all, Iraq had played a very dominant role in what I call Uruba, that is the Arab nationalism. It was a leading force. Saddam did believe that Qawmi al-Arabiya, that this nationalism, Arab nationalism, was the cornerstone of the unity of the Arabs. So that kind of secularization of that idea also was playing now against the Shias. Because if that's what they were doing, then how is it that Iran was interfering and Iran was being invited to come in to make, to provide the services and to provide the support for the government? In other words, Iran was seen actually an outside force that was being brought in, which was systematically actually put out in Saddam's time. So you have political process. If it begins to be defined in ethnic terms and more dealing with political pragmatism, then we have a problem at the interfaith level, because it is translated directly to the population through the preachers who were fiery. And Muharram is coming pretty soon, the very important month in the Iraqi calendar, and that's the month in which some of these ideas are not only nationalistically perpetrated, but also the ideas about the superiority of one sect over the other, and the problems that were faced in the early days of Islam, and the victimization of the Shia, and the Shias have suffered. All these things have become part of the psyche. How exactly do we compensate that? What do we do in order to compensate that? And I think I found two types of weapons being used by the religious leaders to perpetuate the conflict rather than solving it. One was psychological weapon. Psychological weapon, by that I mean bringing history back into focus, for which the present contemporary community has no solution. Because historical differences cannot be solved by the present community. And the more you bring them up, the more you are creating the animosity between people. So you have Baghdad becoming, the Bazaar of Baghdad was actually a model bazaar of coexistence between the Sunni and the Shia, because the bazaar was made up of merchants of both sects. And they participated, and there were intermarriages. Baghdad became a model, for that kind of city of all the Shia and the Sunni together, living together. And there were sheep spots of pilgrimage, even in Baghdad, which the Sunnis also respected. Now, in other words, Iraq has the history of coexistence between the Sunni and the Shia for a long time. What has happened now is that you have forces entering Iraq, all the troublemakers that were in Afghanistan at one point, in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE, were all coming to Iraq. And we know that after the invasion that happened. And there were outside forces fighting the Sunni supremacy and how to come back, to bring back the Sunni domination in Iraq. So we have political processes when they are mixed with ethnic politics and religious politics, they create a psychological, backlash. And that psychological weapon is even more stronger because of the propaganda machine. You have the preachers on television who appear now who could never appear before. And these preachers are not always, talking the language of reconciliation. They're talking the language of conflict. The other part of the battleground is theological. Theological and doctrinal battle, in which the doctrines of one sect are, discussed and put down, or the other sect are, somehow shown to be more reasonable, more rational. All these issues have led us to seek, perhaps, I think idealistically, we propose that there should be new approach to the historical victimization of one group over the other. This is what we call, Joe Montville has written about what we call the political psychology. How do we go in an area in which people have fought with one another for a long time? How do we resolve those issues in that culture when the culture is still replete with religious sensibilities, and also they are always talking about theological doctrines to support their claims, and the victimhood of one has not been recognized by the other. The Shia are always grumbling that the Sunni domination under Saddam never produced any kind of apology on the part of the Sunni community. Now, that doesn't mean that the Shia community should now engage in a reverse kind of wrongdoing against them. They are not, I'm on checking with the public, general public, and you sit with a taxi driver, you sit with the hotel people, and you talk to them and find out, and they would say that, no, I think it's much better at the lower level, the interaction is far more friendlier. It is at the level of administration, the government, that we find problems of, that are not resolved properly by the government. And the sources of healing then also require a theology of compromise, which both theologies are not willing to give in. So if you are talking to the Sunni leaders, and when they talk to you, when they give the khutbahs, they give the sermons on Fridays, you hear one-sided story of how Islam evolved. The early community is still paradigmatic community, the early community of the historical Islam. And the early community still has a lot of impact and followership in both communities, but all depends which personality is more appealing to this community, or which personality is important for the other community. And all these things are clearly stopping the intrafaith dialogue to come to terms with the differences in the society. What we found to be was important that the dialogue was not believed in. We found there was a suspicion on the part of religious leaders. Even the Christian leaders would not believe that there was a seriousness on the part of the government to accommodate minorities and to protect their rights. Because whatever was happening, they were not able to, for example, control those populations that were destroying the churches, or were putting the bombs in the Friday services in Baghdad in the Shia mosque. And Muqtada al-Sadr, by the way, who was a very important, who remains still very important and influential figure in Karbala, we find that he has been told, this is what I've been told, that Iran has asked him to tone down his criticism of the present government. And in other words, you don't find him actively engaged. But Karbala is still a hotbed of what we call the differences. Now I'm talking about the difference between the Shia themselves. So you have supporters of one shrine against the supporters of the other shrine in Iraq, in Karbala. So there are two shrines there, Hussein's shrine and Abbas shrine. And both are regarded by the population as imam, where Abbas is not an imam, and yet it is an important issue in Karbala over which the followers of one shrine and the followers of other shrine are at odds with one another. So you really are looking at more complex situation emerging between the Shias themselves. And then you have among the Sunni tribal leaders, there's more a soft corner for the other tribes who are Shi'i tribes. So these tribes are playing very important role, but the two tribes, the two leadership, the two shuyukh, the leaders of the two different tribes, that is Sunni and the Shi'i tribes, are not talking to one another. So we have the imams not leading the community, and we have also the Ash'ari leaders, that is the tribal leaders, who are not engaging each other in providing what we call the support that is necessary to build a new culture. And I talk about the new culture because up until that moment, I must say that up until the invasion, American invasion, the Shia had no political voice. It's a fact. Yes, the Shia were in the military, the Shia did participate, but the government in Iraq was dominated by a very powerful Sunni minority. And they did not allow for the Shias any space in the political processes. Now the reverse situation has come, and the Sunnis are complaining that, no, we have no voice now, and we need that voice. And what is interesting to find that I met Prince Hassan in Jordan, and he was saying that, that's the solution, to empower the Sunnis. I said, we had also the solution under Saddam's time, which we never said, that there was need for empowerment of the Shia also at that time. Instead, the Shias were thrown out as being Iranians and were, ill-treated. And there has never been an acceptance of the responsibility on the part of the Sunni administrators, or even Al-Ba'ath itself, the army, that has not even conceded that they did anything wrong. It was required of them, and they did it. And this is what I think is creating a very deep rift in these sectarian relations. What I also find to be true is that the fractured social relationships. Now the families are parting with one another. The families that had Shia daughter-in-law, or Shia son-in-law, or Sunni daughter-in-law, are now talking about separation. In other words, there is such a internal struggle going on to identify oneself clearly with one or the other sect, which Saddam or the government, Iraqi government, up to that point had actually not allowed to happen. It was a Sunni-dominated Iraqi society, but the Shias had become very secular. Under that kind of, atrocities committed against them, the Shias had adopted secular, understanding of their role in Iraq, and were willing to support the government, and were in the military, and wherever they were asked to go, they would go. Now, that kind of national cohesion is absent today. There is no national cohesion between the Sunni and the Shia, and I think that's what is, creating the wrongly understood the new political culture in the light of the requirements of the victimizers' complaint against those who have been victimized. The Shia are insisting that they were the mazlumin, they were the wronged people, population for a long time. They are still being wronged, they are still being bombed, their leaders are still being killed, and therefore, there has to be a clear apology and reconciliation between the Sunnis. They should come, forward and present their hands, in peace to the Shias. Now, what we understood and what I understood, and I think my role was this, to move from dialogue to dire practice. And I'll explain a little bit here. Dire practice was the only way to get people to recognize the victimizer and the victim. Getting people to talk to one another at that level of, you did this wrong to me, I did this wrong to you. Let us listen to one another and try to move on now. In other words, using the narratives of wrongdoing, using the narratives of having been wronged by one group at one time, and bringing them out rather than keeping them in. Not talking about those issues actually are suppressing the very important process of healing. Healing comes when the wrongdoer has openly confessed the wrongdoing. Those are fractured relationships in the society, and they need to be somehow brought in such a way that the dialogue turns into dire practice. What do we mean by that? Dialogue on its own, we found, between Sunni and the Shia, between Christian and the Muslims, is not sufficient on its own. It requires showing through action what can be done. And this is what I think is necessary in creating the compatible empathy in the population. Because if they're not willing to forgive, they're not willing to move on, then you find them viciously entertaining destruction of each other. It's like in Karbala, I always felt a tension between those who are going in this shrine and those who are going in this shrine, although they should not have been there. But somehow, it has been generated through religious justifications, as if one is more important than the other. And they all are martyrs in some sense. And yet, the administrators of one shrine against the administrators of other shrine are generating this kind of tension in the population. What is needed here is a dire practice. And dire practice, I want to say, is demonstration through mutual respect and acceptance, not only tolerance, because that doesn't work. Toleration of the Sunni or toleration of the Shia because you happen to be Sunni. Oh, you are wrong, but I tolerate you. Oh, you are Shia, you're hopeless. I still accept you. That doesn't work. In the new national culture that Iraq is trying to build, we find that demonstration through respect and acceptance becomes part of the healing process. And intercommunal relations first of all, need to work out between the leaders of their communities. Now, we hear in the newspapers here, by the way, that Sistani is giving Friday sermons regularly. That's not correct, by the way. Sistani never speaks to the public. He has never been he doesn't give the sermon. His workers, those who work under him, are the ones who are telling the public. In other words, he doesn't have a public statement. He doesn't give those public statements. In other words, you have leaders who could play even more active role are not playing the role. So Sistani, people like Sistani, or Al-Qabusi, and these are the Sunni leaders and the Shia leaders, they are not engaged in what we call conversation among themselves, so that the people would know that these leaders are talking to one another. There is no such confidence being generated. The other part that I think is very damaging in Iraq is mutual dehumanization. When you are willing to kill fellow Muslim simply because he or she happens to be a Shia or a Sunni, then there's a really serious problem in the understanding of the religion. Because in that case, life has been relativized, which can never, can never be tolerated. When human life is brought so down and it is destroyed without any reason, simply because there are differences there that cannot be resolved. These are historical differences. The Shia and Sunni, there is Dar al-Taqrib. They are talking about reconciliation among the Sunni schools, reconciliation among the Sunni schools and the Shia school, and we haven't seen much result. We have in Qom we have, in Cairo we have, and yet those remain, in books and in articles. They are never transmitted. They are never translated to the public as such. Public don't know it. So if you go to Iran or you go to any of the gatherings in Iraq, you do still find a mutual suspicion of each other, which has not been, helpful at all. The other aspect that, that is very, very much worrying most of us is that the theology is still classical theology, which is based on the understanding of the Khilafah, of the Caliphate. Who is the leader of the Muslim community? Who can be the leader of the Muslim community? Yes, I think Shia don't have that vision that the Caliph would come one day, and establish the kingdom of God, so to speak, on earth. But they certainly have an idea of the Mahdi coming. And this idea, by the way, has occurred 4 times already after the American invasion. That there was a man claiming that I'm the messianic leader, the Mahdi. And he came, the first fatwa he gave was that Sistani should be beheaded. And that fatwa was so shocking in the community that they immediately called American, soldiers and American commanders that you have to do something to control this man in Najaf, because the rising was in Najaf. So you have clearly, a potential for explosion. And how exactly can one neutralize that? I think this is the mystery for all of us who are coming from outside. How do we convince that this is not the time for it? And I think the human rights issues, the more you raise the issues, the more you are somehow, deadlocked in the theological debates about whether we know our ethics through God's command or do we know it through human reasoning. And this is still, the major issue about recognizing human rights as human rights themselves and without any qualification. So in other words, the theology that is classically inherited and is being discussed and being taught even now, people are learning that theology. The students in seminaries are still learning that theology. I think it's not conducive at all to dialogue or to reconciliation. It is still perpetuating the same hatred that has been there historically. So we find, this is my last point, that we find there's a diagloss in the situation in Iraqi society. The leaders are engaged in diagloss. And let me explain this. Diaglossic, we have in Persian, we say andaruni biruni. You are an insider and you are an outsider. So the conversation that takes place among ourselves as insiders is different than the one that you convey to the outsiders. This is what we call political diaglossing. That means what I tell my people when I'm with them is different than what I say in public to other leaders and other peoples. This is what I call political hypocrisy. And that is so prevalent that we cannot defeat it without the participation of religious leaders condemning it. That this duplicity is not going to create a better society in Iraq. And everybody is working towards what we call the materialism that I found in Iraq. It's just, there's so much corruption going on that you can't even imagine how people are becoming so oblivious of the poverty around them. People who don't have to eat, who don't have enough. You go to the shrine cities like Kufa, you go to Najaf, there's so much poverty that you can't imagine where did these dollars disappear that came from America through aid programs, through the social programs, political programs. They all have disappeared. In other words, even religious leaders are engaged in misappropriation of the funds. It's not only the people, ordinary people. And I think there's a good Arabic saying, in the Prophet's own, parlance, "An-nas ala dini mulukim." People follow the religion of those who exercise authority over them. If those who are exercising authority are not sincere in solving the problems of the society, how is the society going to solve its own problems? You have a double catch, so to speak. The politicians are not willing to do it. And we had a very short meeting with Nouri Malik at that point this year when we were there. And it was almost defensive discourse that he engaged in. We're not doing that, we are not doing that, we are not doing this. Then why is there a complaint on the grounds? Why is there a complaint among people that you are not, treating them as equal citizens? So you are engaged in that kind of conversation with the leaders, and it's a moribund. You don't know how to come out of it. And the more we tried to talk to the religious leaders, we also had leaders from Syria, religious leaders. The Mufti of Syria was there. The Mufti of Palestine was there, of the occupied territories. They're all there, and we were talking to all of them, and they had similar complaints about politicians using religion for their own ends rather than helping people to become better human beings. So that was the crux of the problem. And I think at the moment, I'm very bleak. I have been invited to go again to University of Kufa and, work with the religious leaders and some of the policymakers. And I'm wondering how safe it would be to go, but I'm willing, they've assured me that Najaf is secured. So come to University of Kufa, and this is what we can do. But I don't know if I will be able to go. In sum, I would say that my experience in May was not very positive. It made me even more pessimistic because I realized that the leaders were not willing to budge from their own self-righteous theologies and positions. And unless that happens, we cannot see any change coming in the population. Thank you very much.